Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning into today's session. This is Thomas Hyman, and I'm the founder and CEO of Realty Partners. And today I'm going to talk about something that is going to be of great interest to you, whether you are a real estate professional or you're just someone interested in real estate investing. And that is an introduction to the world of real estate investing and really giving you a formula for success, because real estate investing doesn't have to be risky. And if you look back at the last boom that we had, the reason that so many quote unquote investors lost their shirt is because they violated these very principles that I'm going to talk about. Real estate investing at its core, if done properly, is really one of the best and least risky investment strategies that you can employ. And there are a lot of benefits associated with it, from tax advantages, write-offs, capturing net operating losses, to having that, residual income stream that is being developed. And so I'm a pretty avid real estate investor myself. And I'm not just going to share some theories with you, but things actually that have worked for me and are working for me right now. So without any further ado, I'm going to switch to a screen share here. And let's get started. So again, this is an introduction to real estate investing, and you make your profit when you buy, or in other words, how to become a better investor. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today, a brief overview. The first one is types of investments. There are many different types of real estate investments that you can take advantage of, and so we're going to touch on that. The next one is your investment objective. It's really, really important for you to get clarity on what your objective is. Is it to make a quick hit profit, like in a flip situation, or are you looking for long-term cash flow? Are you looking for tax advantages? So these are all considerations for you to look at. How to evaluate investment opportunities is absolutely critical. And again, you make money when you buy. And these are all things that you want to be able to bring to the table as a real estate professional. Most of you probably are realtors or brokers. So being able to assist your client in evaluating investment opportunities is absolutely critical. And the formula for success really is to make a profit when you buy. So it's not some kind of, pray and hope for the best, or you think somehow in the back of your mind that it might be a good deal if property values continue to go up 5%, 10% a year, then you're going to make all that money down the road. That's wishful thinking and a recipe for disaster. You want to have a formula for success, and the key is to make a profit when you buy. So let's take a look at the different type of real estate investments. The first two ones are income producing strategies or types of investments. So we have income producing residential, and you have single family versus multifamily. Single family really is anything from 1 to 4 units by its legal definition. So it could be condominiums, it could be single family homes, it could be duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, or multifamily, which really would be, like a small apartment complex or a large apartment complex. The other income producing niche is commercial. And we're going to take a look at gross lease versus triple net lease, and also build to lease are opportunities. So build to lease would be, for example, where you have a piece of land and you built to lease out as a custom construction basically for the tenant, and then you go on a long-term lease with that. Then we have speculative land investments for developers, and the two types of investment as a top level category would be income producing or speculative. Now, income producing, as the name says, is going to generate an income for you. Speculative is where you hope for, you speculate that the value goes up. And so land for development is a speculative investment. And if you really know what you're doing and you have the right resources, i.e. the right people to handle required change in zoning and so forth, it can be very, very lucrative. So if you buy a piece of land that is zoned agricultural and you can get that rezoned for, you know, commercial or mixed use or residential, then obviously the value of that land goes up considerably. Then we have the speculative residential. This would include your flips. So if you buy something, let's say you buy an REO property and you spend $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for it, and then you fix up, you put 20, 30 into it, and so now you might have, you know, between 65 and 100,000 into it, but you then turn around and sell it to an owner occupant for $20,000, $30,000 more. Or what the most successful flippers are doing is you rent it out and then package it and sell it to an investor. So for example, if you have a property that you have now $90,000 into it, and it might be worth $120,000 to an owner occupant, so you can try to sell it for $120,000, then you got a $30,000 spread minus your selling expenses and so forth. So you might end up making a $20,000 profit. Or you could say, okay, this property, let's say, is going to rent for $1,500 a month. And so at $1,500 a month, just cash on cash return, if you were to pay cash for that property, that's $18,000 a year in gross income. And now you deduct management and other things. But your net income of that property might be $90,000. And at that level, it is worth a lot more money. It could be worth $150,000 for an investor to get a 7 or 8% return. So the different ways to look at the flip equation. So speculative residential is where you speculate that the value goes up. Condo conversions during the boom was obviously a speculative residential, where all the people jumped in on the condo conversions and hoped to flip them, and some of them got lucky and were able to, and as you know, many of them were not. And then we have speculative commercial. Again, your reasoning is that the property will go up in value because of future development, because of things that are happening down the road. And then last but not least, lending. Now lending, huge caution here. Number one, as we all know, even first position mortgages can be very, very risky. And during the downturn, that became quite glaringly obvious, but now also a lot of rules have come into play, brought to us by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and its affiliates, government cronies. And so now it's already becoming very difficult to do a seller finance type of transaction. But if you wanted to be a hard money lender, or you wanted to be a mortgage lender, then depending on that one, on the property, you may have to be licensed as a loan originator. So it's getting very, very tricky, and you need to be very, very careful in that, because if you are not properly licensed for the type of transaction that you're doing, if your borrower defaults on the loan, you may not have any recourse. So the lending is still a possibility, but you may want to talk to an attorney if you're thinking about originating loans. The primary way to make money right now in the lending area without having to be a licensed loan originator is in the buying and selling of paper. So for example, if I'm going to make a loan to Joe to buy a property, most likely I would have to be licensed as a loan originator in order to do that. But if I'm going to buy a note or buy a mortgage from someone that did the mortgage to Joe, so if I'm going to go to XYZ Lending and buy the paper off them at the discount, now I don't have to be. And there are huge opportunities with buying notes at a discount. So if you have a note, for example, that carries a 5 or 6% interest rate, and then you're buying it at a discount, that might bump your interest rate up to 8, 9, 10, 12% or even more. So those are the type of investments that you're looking at within the real estate investment field. So let's take a look at some of the objectives. Number one, you have to know what your outcome is before you get into a deal. So deal selection is incredibly important. And I'm not exaggerating when I say the transactions that I'm doing right now, that we probably look at a total of 50 potential deals for every deal that we end up doing. And out of those 50, we might take a closer look at 3 or 4, and then one we actually pull the trigger on. So you really need to know what the outcome is and establish a set of rules that you can then quickly apply towards these potential deals that come your way, so you can know immediately whether or not it's even worth going any further. There's this bucket theory of investing that I personally subscribe to, and it really deals with outcome and risk. You have the security bucket. The security bucket has to be an incredibly secure liquid investment, something that you can convert into cash, and something that is extremely unlikely to go down in value. And then you have a growth bucket. You buy and hold long-term, and your momentum short-term. So security bucket would be something like cash, or U.S. Treasuries, or very, very high quality investments, not stocks or bonds. Your home could be in the security bucket if you pay cash for your home. Or if you get a really incredible deal on a property, and you pay cash for it and there's no exposure, and you rent it out, you might have it in the security bucket, although that's almost going into the growth bucket. Security bucket is really just your security funds, your safety funds, whereas your growth bucket is the bucket that is designed to grow. And so the income producing properties, for the most part, would go into the buy and hold category. So if you're buying rental properties with a view to hold on to them long term, and the flippers would be in your momentum category. So you need to ask yourself, where does your investment fit in within that category? What you're looking at. Is it momentum? Is it buy and hold? Is it security? And when you're looking at your total cash available for investment overall, you need to create some rules and decide, okay, I'm going to put 25 or 30% in my security bucket. I'm going to put, maybe 40% in my buy and hold bucket, and 20 or 30% in the momentum bucket, because obviously the risk is much greater on the momentum bucket than on the buy and hold is still more risky than the security bucket, because you can't convert it into cash in an emergency if you would have to. And that's really driven by your risk tolerance. So if you're young, you might have a greater risk tolerance, and you might put more into momentum bucket. For example, a lot of guys that have $0 to start out with, while doing flips where you use a hard money lender to engineer the flip, might be a great way just to get the ball rolling. If you have zero money really to get started with, you cannot afford to buy a rental property cash and sit on it and have it generate income. But if you can do flips, and let's say you make $20,000, $30,000 per flip, you could do 3-4 flips, then buy a property, pay cash for it, and just sit on it and generate rental income. My rule of thumb, but what's working for us really, is an average cost of about $65,000 paid, once it's fixed up. And these are lower income type of areas, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, concrete block construction homes. And after paying, everything, taxes, insurance, et cetera, we generally net $1,000 a month on those. So you invest $65,000, you're generating $12,000 a year in net income. So if you don't have anything, you might start with doing a couple of flips, then buy and hold. Do some more flips, buy and hold, and just slowly build up a portfolio that way. So your risk tolerance should drive the strategy, and you certainly don't want to, if you're in your 50s or 60s, dump all your money into the momentum area. So let's take a look at evaluating investments. Number one, you have to know your outcome, your objective again. Number two, once you know what your outcome objective is, you got to have a formula to determine profitability, so you know whether or not this can meet your criteria, whether it is on a long-term hold, income-producing property, or whether it is on a short-term flip. You got to have formulas that you can just plug in, and I use spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets or Google Sheets, to quickly plunk in the numbers and see whether or not something meets our criteria. You have to understand the difference between net operating income versus cash flow. The two are not the same, and a lot of investors get burnt by that. You might get all excited about net operating income, but end up having negative cash flow. And what kills more real estate investors than anything else is negative cash flow, or being too close on the border that all of a sudden, if you have a big repair or you have a tenant that needs to be evicted and the place is vacant for a few months, you're going deep in the hole, So you have to understand the difference between the two. You also need to understand the cap rate, the capitalization rate. And there's some formulas I'm going to give you that you can use to really determine whether or not something meets your objective. Also, your return on investment, which is very different from your cap rate and your net operating income. So I'm going to go over these terms, but we got basically four major terms here: NOI, or net operating income, versus cash flow, versus cap rate, versus return on investment, also sometimes referred to as the internal rate of return or cash on cash return. And then you need to understand positive versus negative leverage. So let's hop in. By the way, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A tag either on the top right or on the bottom of your screen, and you can plug in your question, and after the presentation I'm going to take a look at it, and if there are any questions I will answer them, or otherwise just leave notes on the bottom if you're watching the recording, and I will get back to you. So I went ahead and created a little spreadsheet, a little table here to illustrate net operating income. On the left-hand side, we have your typical residential property. On the right-hand side is your typical commercial property. And I'm just using a big number to make it easier to understand from the math. So we have the gross income is the same on both sides, $100,000. Let's take a look at the operating expenses. So we have management operating expenses. Good idea is to figure 10%, even if you pay a little bit less, figure 10% in your calculations. You're paying that on both sides. And we have maintenance. Now notice on the right-hand side in the commercial, we're talking about a triple net lease. And what that NNN stands for is that basically the tenant pays for all maintenance, all taxes, and all insurance. So these three expense categories are not an expense to you as a landlord if the property is rented out. Advertising, same on both sides. Utilities, insurance, again, only on the residential side. Real estate taxes. Let's say you have a mortgage on it. You have depreciation, of course. Gives you your net operating income. So your net operating income is your gross income minus all operating expenses, minus your interest expense if you are financing, minus your depreciation on the property, leaves you with your net operating income. So far, so good. Looks like a great deal here. And on the left-hand side, on the residential, we have a $19,900, almost $20,000 net operating income. On the right-hand side, it's almost twice that because we don't have to pay for taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Let's take a look at cash flow as a contrast. So here's our net operating income. Let's look at cash flow. We got the same property, same scenario. Here's our cash flow. So our cash flow is much better than our net operating income. And by the way, the debt service, I did this presentation quite a while ago, and most likely a debt service is a little bit higher than that. But there's not much spread between $32,000, $35,000. Maybe at the beginning of the loan, you might be there. But anyhow, what we don't have in here is your depreciation. And we are including the entire debt service payment that is being made. So your cash flow looks better than your net operating income. And I just want you to keep that in mind. Cash flow better than the net operating income. Now, again, to determine your cash flow, you take your gross income minus all of your expenses, minus your debt service, which really is also, it's not part of your expense really, because if you have $32,000 in interest, but you're paying $35,200, so it's an extra $3,200 that is coming out in the form of cash, but it's not an expense because you're repaying the loan. That's payment on the principal. Also on the NOI, you have your depreciation expense, which is an expense, but it's not cash coming out of your pocket. So that's where the difference between the two comes in. So let me scroll back here just to look at it again. I know this can be overwhelming, and if you contact me, I'll be happy to send you the slides. But we have the net operating income here. You have your total interest expenses. You have, your total operating expenses, your interest expenses, and your depreciation. Your operating expenses, of course, are going to be the same in both calculations. And now also, when I do my personal NOI calculation, I also plug in an additional vacancy reserve of 10%. So I would have put in another $10,000 in vacancy reserves just to have a safe buffer, which obviously would have then dropped the net operating income down to $9,000 in my evaluation. So here again, we have the same operating expenses, but now we have the debt service, including interest, but we don't have the depreciation. So if I were to add $10,000 on the left-hand side for vacancy reserves, the 10% I usually use, that would drop the cash flow down to $23,000 as opposed to $33,000, just as a more realistic calculation, because you do want to have that extra buffer. I'll get to that more in a minute. So here's net operating income versus cash flow, and a couple of different scenarios. Good would be positive net operating income and cash flow. Bad would be positive net operating income and negative cash flow. Okay, so that would be bad. And that's very rarely ever possible. But the next one, this one here, does happen a lot, which is negative net operating income and positive cash flow. So, I mean, you could say, sure, I don't mind having a negative net operating income because of the depreciation. So if your cash flow is so borderline that you're just about, making ends meet, and then you add in the negative, the deduction for your depreciation, then that is going to drop your net operating income into negative territory, which might be okay if you have a lot of other income to offset. So, as a real estate professional, which would be you as a realtor, or if somebody is an investor, you can carry that negative net operating loss over and apply it towards regular income. So it can be a good thing, but most people aren't professional investors. You as a real estate professional, if you do investments yourself, you're considered a real estate professional for tax purposes, and so you can benefit from that, from these net operating losses that are incurred. Most Joes that are doing real estate investments, they have a regular job. It's a part-time thing on the side, so they don't have any benefit from that net operating loss necessarily. Here's what's really ugly and what will get you killed, and that is when you have both negative NOI and negative cash flow. Cash flow is always more important than the NOI because, you know, having negative cash flow is obviously what's going to kill you. Let's take a look at the capitalization rate, the cap rate. And you're going to see the astonishing difference between the NOI and the cap rate, because the NOI is taken just on the earnings generated on the profit, versus the cap rate looks at the total value of that investment. So if you have a property that is worth $500,000 and it generates $100,000 in gross income, it's very different than if you have a property that's worth $2 million and it generates $100,000 gross income. And so let's take a look at that. The capitalization rate is figured by dividing the NOI by the value. So let's take a look at the previous example, and let's say that that $100,000 gross income was generated by $500,000 worth of property. Okay, and so here's the calculation. The net operating income was $19,000 on the residential, $39,000 on the commercial, which would give you a cap rate of 3.99% on the residential and 7.83% on the commercial. So if you can get the numbers to work on the commercial side that way, it would be a great deal. If you get the numbers to work that way on the left-hand side, then really it wouldn't be a great deal. And so you want to take a look at that and give you an idea on a typical property that I'm doing right now. I have a $12,000 net operating income a year, or $1,000 a month is what I'm going to net, and I don't have any interest expense because it's a cash purchase. But so if I take that $12,000 and divide it by the $65,000 that I have into it, I'm coming up with a cap rate that is in the 18% range. And that is a great investment. Also, if you have a cap rate that is higher, you can create positive leverage by financing. On this cap rate of 3.99%, your interest rate on a commercial loan on an investment property is going to be higher than that. So you're going to go in the hole. Over here, the almost 8%, okay, if you can borrow the money at, let's say, 4 or 5%, you're still ahead and you have positive leverage, but you're too close to the wire, really, to do that because, if you have a couple of bad events, your cash flow is not going to cover it. Here is a family of formulas that you want to jot down. And the three variables are V for value, I for the net operating income, and R for the cap rate. And so to determine the value, you take the net operating income and divide it by the cap rate. So if you're looking at a property, somebody's pitching your property, then you say, okay, what is the NOI? Okay. All right, let's say that NOI is $10,000 a year, okay? And what is your personal rate of return, okay? So if your personal rate of return is 10%, let's say, so $10,000 divided by 10% or divided by 0.10, which is 10%, 1/10, would give you a value of $100,000. If your minimum cap rate is 8%, okay, that would give you a value of at least $80,000. Okay, so you can run your numbers that way and determine if the property makes sense to buy. If your value based on your rate of return that you want to get and the net operating income that you know is there based on documentation historically, and it's worth $80,000 to you, and you can buy it for $60,000, it's a great deal, obviously. But if you can buy it for $100,000, it's a bad deal because the value isn't there. Income is value times the rate of return. And again, the cap rate is the income divided by the value. So you want to have those formulas handy and use them to evaluate your property. Let's take a look at return on investment as opposed to net operating income. So let's say we have the example that we used, $500,000 property with $100,000 down payment, 20%. So your total funds invested is $100,000. And your return on investment is not based on the value of the property. Your return on investment is your rate of return on your cash on cash return. If you put X dollars in cash into the deal, what is your return on that investment? So in this case, the amount invested is $100,000. So if we have a net operating income of $19,000 based on the $100,000 invested, that is actually an excellent rate of return on investment. And to calculate the rate of, the ROI, you take the income and divide it by the investment. And again, the formula that I used in the numbers, they have $500,000 and the $100,000. These are just numbers to make it easy to wrap your head around it. But in the real world scenario, odds are you're not going to have a property that has a 4% cap rate and a 19% ROI. Those numbers just don't add up. I mean, the truth is, if you got a $400,000 mortgage, then your payment would be a lot higher than what we had in debt service. So let's take if you have a $400,000 mortgage at, let's say, 5% for a investment property, and so 5% on $400,000 mortgage would be, roughly $20,000 plus the additional debt service that you have, the principal and so forth. So you just got to run your numbers. Now, for precise calculations, when you use your income, your net operating income, you would use income after taxes. So for example, up here, where you have a $20,000 net operating income, if you are at a 25% tax rate, then that means, of course, that you're going to get hit with a $5,000 tax bill on that. So you're down to $15,000 in net operating income. So again, the main message I want to get across here is that numbers never lie, and you want to use specific formulas to determine whether or not something is a good deal, whether something makes sense. Let's take a look at a couple of rules for positive versus negative leverage. So positive leverage happens when the cost of the money is lower than the cap rate or the rate of return on the money borrowed. So if you can borrow money at 3%, but you can make 5% with it, then that is a positive leverage. Negative leverage is if the cost of money is greater than the cap rate or the rate of return. So if you have a cap rate of, let's say 4%, but your mortgage rate is 6%, you're in negative leverage. And you really got to look at the core numbers, because here's the deal. When you have a $500,000 property, again, to use that example, but you're only going to get financing on 400,000, right? So the your cap rate of X percent, let's say 4% is the cap rate, but that's on the entire $500,000. And you really have to look at it almost as if you would borrow $500,000 on that to determine positive or negative cash flow. Because, if your cap rate on $500,000 is 4% or $20,000, and you get a loan of $400,000 at, let's say, 5%, then that 5% equals 20,000, which is the same as the 4% on the $500,000. So you might think it is a wash, but it isn't. You're in negative leverage territory because you want to look at, okay, what kind of return am I getting on my cash that I put in, and then on the balance that I finance, what's the picture there? And if you're going in the hole on the financing and basically have your negative leverage eat up your principal and your return on the cash that you put in, then it's a stupid deal. So you really have to look at the numbers overall. And again, it's very simple. If the cost of the money is lower than the cap rate, then you're A-okay. If it's higher, then that's bad. And in very simple terms, once you determine your cap rate, and I would, again, plug in your maintenance reserves and so forth and be as conservative as you can in that spreadsheet that you set up. And if that cap rate is, 6 or 7% and it costs you 5% to borrow the money, the spread is just not justifying it. Now, if you can get an 8 or 10% cap rate and you can borrow money at 4 or 5%, then it makes sense. Using positive leverage will increase your ROI because on that financed amount you're making money on. That $400,000 that you're borrowing, you're making more money on that loan than it costs you to get that loan. But using negative leverage will decrease your ROI. So if you have negative leverage, you're losing money on the portion that you borrow, and those losses are eating up the money that you make or even your principal on your down payment. So you always want to look for positive leverage. So the key again is to make a profit when you buy. And the formula for success for income producing properties is you want to look at a cap rate of at least 8%, minimum 8%. I would look at 10 to 12% plus. And right now, we're really in a very unique situation where truly 14+% are very, very doable. And if you go into lower income areas, you can easily have 16 to 18% or even more in terms of cap rate. I'm a big believer in cash, but if you have to use leverage, make sure that you have all three of them covered: positive leverage, positive net operating income, and positive cash flow. Make sure all three of these are solidly in the plus. And that's with reserves, etc. Calculate proper reserves. 10% vacancy, 10% management, and minimum of 1% of value for repairs. And that's a minimum of 1% of value for repairs. I personally like to use 2 to 3%. It all depends. I mean, obviously, if you buy a property and everything is brand new now, and you put a new roof, new flooring, new AC, new water heater, new this, new that, I mean, what can really break at this point? So you might be better, might be able to go with a lower value for repairs. But if the roof needs to be replaced in the next 5-10 years, you want to budget for that. And you can set up very complicated rules like, associations do for condominiums, where they take each individual item. Let's say the roof, it costs this much. It has a life expectancy of this many years. Adjusted for inflation, it will cost this much in X years to replace. And therefore, if there's, 8 years left in life, then you divide that by 8, and you need to have so much in reserves. You can build your reserves based on that. So that would be a very complicated way to go. Rule of thumb really would be 2 to 3% of value of the property for repairs, and even for your home too, and your primary home. but a minimum, bare minimum of 1%, even if you, just replaced everything. You want to have enough buffer to compensate for insurance and tax increases. So don't cut yourself too tight. A lot of newbie investors, they run their numbers and they're really just barely breaking even. And it turns out next year taxes go up, insurance rates go up, and all of a sudden they're in negative cash flow territory, and you don't want to be in that situation. So you want to make sure that there's enough buffer. You want to also take a look at multifamily and commercial. Multifamily can sometimes give you a much lower cost per unit. So if you buy, let's say, for example, a house that might cost you $80,000, well, you might be able to get a duplex for $120,000, which brings your cost per unit down to $60,000, and you might still be able to get the same amount of rent. On commercial transactions, you want to make sure that you do triple net on all commercial transactions, which of course also means that you need to do proper vetting and background checks on your commercial tenants to ensure that they have the financial wherewithal to make those payments. And when you're looking at your vacancy time on the commercial, you need to keep in mind that while it's great to have the tenant pay for taxes, insurance, maintenance, etc., when that tenant is not in the space, then you're going to have to pay for that yourself, and that's going to hit your cash flow. So you need to have the reserves in place. On speculative investment, here's the formula for success. Number one, you need to decide on your intended return on investment, your must return, and that is return on cash invested. Number two, you have to calculate based on worst case scenario. Number three, you have to buy with the intended profit in mind today and then discount today's value by at least 25%. Okay? So what does that mean? It basically means that whatever return you think you're going to make, cut it by 25% and see if it still makes sense. Okay? So if you need to make $10,000, then you really need to make at least $13,000, because if you discount it by 25%, that's when you're going to end up with that $10,000. Very, very important, because everything costs more and takes longer in the final analysis. When you're looking at long-term investments, speculative investments, you need to discount the future value of money. Okay? $1 million in 5 years is not the same as $1 million today. You have inflation, you have a decline in buying power, you have the opportunity loss. I mean, right now, for example, if I have $1 million, I could easily, without any doubt, buy 15 properties, 15 rental properties. I think it'll be very conservative. In 5 years, I think this REO game, this opportunity of being able to buy distressed properties below market value, I think will be gone. And in 5 years with $1 million, I might only be able to buy 8 properties. Okay. So what's the opportunity cost? So you need to look at the future value of money when you're calculating future returns. If you're going to lock up money long-term in a speculative investment, you have to take that into account. What else could you be doing with that money during that time? And if you cannot meet your intended ROI on the worst case scenario, then don't do the deal. You really have to have the numbers drive the logic. And again, if you cannot meet the return on the worst case scenario, then don't do the deal. And I would personally stay away from leverage. Leverage can sink a speculative deal and sink you. So you don't want to use leverage unless you can afford to carry for several years, and then still under worst case scenario, you're coming out ahead and making a killing. If you can't do that, then don't use leverage as a lending. Today, you can use Realty Mogul and a whole bunch of other sites. There are crowdfunding, crowdsourcing websites for real estate deals where you can do equity crowdsourcing. So instead of you putting in $50,000 and looking for a $250,000 loan, you can put in $50,000 and looking for investors to put in the other $250,000 in the form of equity. So they're going to get, obviously part of the deal. But if your overall, ROI and cap rate add up, you're still making a huge return on the money that you put in, but you're not using leverage that can then kill you because of cash flow concerns and so forth. Because one of the things about leverage is that debt costs you money every month. If I own a property free and clear and I have to sit on it for 6 months for whatever reason, the only cost I have is taxes and maybe insurance. But if I have a property and I have a 80% mortgage on it and I sit on it for 6 months, that cash flow, that negative cash flow every month for 6 months can kill me if I don't have the money in the bank to easily carry it. All right. So if you like this content, I would like to ask you to follow me, and you can follow me on Twitter at Thomas Hyman. On Facebook, I have 2 Facebook sites. One is facebook.com/Mission of Success. That's my personal site. And the other one is facebook.com/Realty Partners LLC. And Mission of Success, I'm posting a lot of business-related stuff and success-related stuff. On Realty Partners LLC, obviously primary real estate-related stuff, but a lot of resources, training, valuable information. So even if you're with a different company, doesn't matter. These are just resources that are put out there. So I highly recommend you to go ahead and follow me. And then I also have 2 blogs. I have thomashyman.com and I have thelifeofanentrepreneur.com. So please go ahead and follow me if you are interested in this kind of content. And I try to do trainings once a week, so you can go ahead and find a posting about the training event, or once you register, I'll send you a weekly, just a short email letting you know of the event that comes on. And as always, if you cannot make the time of the event, then go ahead and register anyways, because I email a link to a replay the following day. So you'll always get the information. Okay, so let me see if anyone posted anything on the Q&A here, and I've never used the Q&A app on here. And no Q&A. So anyways, thank you so much for taking your time to join me. I hope you got some good information out of this. And like I said, please follow me on Twitter or on Facebook, and I will be happy to just share as much information with you as I can. I'm going to actually go ahead and reshare the screen right now, just so that you can take down that information. And as I said before, I'm here to help. Please contact me if you have any questions at all. And if you want to get a copy of these slides, shoot me a message right on Facebook or on Twitter with your email address, and I'll be sure to get it out to you. Okay? Thanks so much again, and have a wonderful day and what's left of the week. And I hope to connect with you again soon. Bye-bye.